So what we're going to talk a bit about today is the kinds of people that made this house. Now for some of you it may be kind of redundant, but for others that's okay. So if you look at the trades in England, which were the roots of our heritage, you had very rigid lines. You had carpenters who basically did framing and construction and roof and all that sort of thing really well. Then you moved into joiners who did things like windows and doors and trim and that kind of thing, and some basic furniture pieces, but not much. And then you had cabinet makers who made the loose pieces that tended to fill a house. In England, those were incredibly tightly regulated and very tightly guarded. So if a joiner started doing something that a cabinet maker was allowed to do, there would be complaints filed, and the trade guild would come down and say, no, stop that, you know. So when we got over here, though, it was a whole different critter, because people who could do joinery could probably do some furniture stuff or do some carpentry, although they may not be specifically trained in it. And with the lack of resources, people just kind of started blending from one trade to another and learning from the people around them. So my understanding is the folks that built this place kind of fell into those categories. Obviously, this place started with brickwork. And I think it was a guy named Hugh Chisholm, who was primarily a brick worker, who was responsible for laying out and building and making all these brick and putting it together. Although I do remember reading where he was kind of baffled about the idea of a perfect octagon. So Thomas Jefferson, as president, came all the way out here and spent about 2 weeks laying out the foundation. And then, of course, you get these weird angle bricks and that kind of stuff, but that was all part of his work. But there was also some reading I did that talked about he also did some carpentry work. But then I think the bulk of the framing was done, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, since you know more about this than me, was John and Reuben Perry. They're regional guys. Did I get that right?
I think they were up near regional, close enough. I think Charlottesville.
Yeah.
I know John was up there.
Yeah, these are people, tradesmen that Thomas knew from working at Monticello. Hey, I like your work here. Go out there and do that. So the carpenters would be responsible for the framing, the roofs and all that. And what I wanted to talk a bit about was some of the joinery that would be used, and to give some people an introduction as to how this joinery is made, cut out, laid out, and that sort of thing. When you're upstairs, you notice that a lot of the joints are mortise and tenon joints. And they come in two flavors, one being a blind version where you've got a hole in one side but not the other. And then you've got a through version where it comes through on both sides. They're not that tough to make, and they're incredibly important. There you go. Take them apart. They're reasonably tight. Not my best work. When I knew I was going to be doing this, I spent a day in the shop and put together all these joints. So excuse any gaps and errors and that kind of stuff. But the mortise and tenon has been around for, thousands of years. And it's basically a way of putting two pieces of wood together. Sometimes it's locked together with a pin. And you see that a lot upstairs in the framing. The tenon goes into a mortise or a hole, and a pin goes through to be able to do that. When it's used for framing and other situations, alignment's important. So one of the things that when I'm going to be doing a mortise and tenon joint, one of the first things I do is I decide which face is going to be what I call a reference face. Okay? What are you going to do all of your measurements from? So I put an X on those two faces. That's my reference face. First thing I do. Then I decide which piece is going to get the mortise and which one's going to get the tenon. So what I've got here is a marking gauge, and it's set up for my mortising chisel. Now, since I'm working small scale, this is a 1/4 inch chisel. And it's got two pins right here that are set the same width as my chisel, which makes the cutting part go a whole lot quicker. Using my reference face for the mortise, I'm going to scribe 2 lines right here. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me where the outside and the inside is. So how big is your mortise? Well, the rule of thumb typically is approximately 1/3. 1/3 on one cheek, 1/3 on the other, 1/3 comes out of the middle for the tenon. If you make any of the other parts too skinny or too thick, you end up with breakage and all that. If it's going to be a blind mortise, just mark one side, that's all you have to do. If you're going to be doing a through mortise, you need to mark the other side, making sure you get the same reference face. Okay? Then you can come in with, decide where your piece is going to be. So if this is going to be my tenon, I need to make some decisions. Is the tenon going to be full width? Is it going to have a haunch, which is a strength device that helps keep twisting down? Or is it going to have shoulders all the way around? And that depends upon how it's being used. Being a furniture guy, I like having really clean, tight lines where the two boards come together. So I typically move in from the ends a quarter inch or so, unless I'm doing haunch mortises and that kind of thing. So I mark out where this is going to be, and then that allows me to take a square and go across. My personal preference is if I'm going to cut it, I use a marking knife to give me a precise reference. If I just need to keep track of things, I use a pencil. So I can lay this out with a marking knife where I want it to be. Now I'm ready to start chopping. I'm not going to get into all that, but it's basically the process of taking the mortising chisel, starting away from the end, leaving some things chopped down multiple times. But I leave wood at both ends to protect it, so as I lever out the chips, I'm not going to crush the woods on the end. Now you could say that because I've got a quarter inch inset, I can crush that all I want. It's going to be hidden inside. That's true. But I like to be pretty inside and out. Okay? So if you look at those joints I cut, they're pretty clean. Once you cut it down to the depth, then you're ready to start working with the tenon. I don't know what the measurements are, and it doesn't matter. My gauge is still the same. I go to my reference surface, and I can mark the ends. And I have to apologize for the modern marking gauge. I need to decide how long my tenon is going to be. So let's say I'm going to make it an inch. So I can come in here an inch, create a mark, and I square all the way around. And what that's going to do is going to give me the shoulders where the two surfaces come together. And scribe off that line. So now what I've defined is where my tenon is, which is the opposite of the mortise. So I cut out the sides, leave the center, and I go down to this line. My habit is to, when I would use a saw to cut right across here. I don't saw up to my mark. I leave 1/16 fat or so I can come in with the chisel and make that nice and clean. Again, I'm doing furniture work, so I want nice, clean, tight-fitting joints. If you're doing timber framing, you can do whatever it is your tolerances are. I would then clamp this, saw down the sides, staying right on my line, cut across the cheeks, and then that would leave me a tenon, which is the same thickness as that mortise, but wide, because remember I offset a quarter inch here. I would then lay this up and mark, because if you measure and then move, you might make a mistake. If you just lay it next to it and take your marking knife, just zip it off, doesn't matter what the numbers are, it's going to fit. Take out those two pieces and you end up with that, okay? So then it's just a matter of cleaning and fitting with your chisel until you get a nice snug fit to where it comes down and it seats. I've got this turned around. It's the other reason for marking joints. Now if you notice, on everything I make furniture-wise, I mark all my joints, because if I cut 10 of these, they're going to be similar, but not identical. So in everything I make, if you look at the dumbwaiter over there and the one that's disassemblable, it's just in pieces sitting there, there's marks telling you which joint goes with which mortise and tenon. So for a carpenter, the mortise and tenon is probably one of the most common joints you're going to use in the framing, getting members to stay together. You typically lay them out in such a way so that gravity is what holds them together, and what the pins do is that the pins just keep it from coming apart. And you do the same thing with laying out other kinds of joints. So that is probably going to cover a lot of the carpenter's work, the joinery and the heavy duty stuff to get the framing up. There's one other joint I've seen in framing, and it's this dovetail joint. I've seen this used on, imagine this is a rafter and this is a collar tie. And what it does is the dovetail shape helps prevent that from coming apart this way. This one's not pegged, and it's laid out very simply. On lap joints, you like to have it approximately in the middle. That doesn't have to be exact. So I've seen people try to do lap joints by meticulously measuring this thickness and then meticulously measuring that thickness to get it the same. Simpler way to do it. If you're working on a large piece, this is roughly the angle you want. Reference surface, reference surface. Go to the single pin side and you measure off the reference surface. 1, 2, off the reference surface. 1, 2. Just remember that on that, one side goes on one, the other side goes on the other. And if this line is off center, it doesn't matter. The two combined are going to come out perfect and end up with that joint. Then all you need to worry about with this joint is what keeps it from coming apart. Where are we at? There it is. And so peg through there will keep it from moving. So that is a joint that I've seen used in rafter framing.
Is there a proportion you use to come up with this?
The only thing you need to be careful of on any dovetailing work is if this angle is too steep. You notice the grain is right here. If there's too much of a sharp angle between the line of the grain and this particular piece, it's prone to breakage right there. Okay? This one is probably pretty radical. I'm not trained as a carpenter. You know, before he retired, I would have talked to Garland Wood at Williamsburg and say, what's the proportion? And he'd tell me. But, so I just threw that together as an example. It's probably a little more steep than it should be because you run the risk of chipping and breaking. But then again, with the thickness, it's, no big deal. I know on furniture, the ratio that you typically use is anywhere from 1:5 to 1:7 ratio. Those give you enough flair to have some real physical strength, but not be so sharp that you're prone to breakage and splitting on the wood.
Okay.
So with that, I'm no joiner. Austin here has been way more involved in joinery and the joiner's work since that, so I'm going to let him take it from here. And then I'm going to come back at the end and talk about the furniture stuff and the work of the Monticello joinery.
Yeah, so talking kind of the three principal trades that are happening here. Carpentry, joinery, and then of course cabinet making. So as Dan mentioned, there you are. Let's see. Fine woodworking tools. So carpentry, joinery, and cabinet making. Most of what I do would fall within the joinery department. John Hemmings was, of course, the master joiner of the Monticello Joiners Shop, and but he also engaged in furniture making, things that would have typically been done by cabinet makers. Though joiners do make furniture as well, like Dan mentioned, doors, windows. Think of like built-ins would have been the joiner's work, but simple furniture as well. And so that kind of gets into the question of standards of workmanship. thinking carpentry. I started as a construction worker many years ago, and the rule was kind of like you work to 1/4 of an inch, and you get into doing trim. They're like 1/8 of an inch, and then you get into, I'm sure, like cabinet making. With cabinet shop I worked in, they were doing 32nd of an inch, and I'm just like, at that point, I don't know how close you're actually getting. But anyways, you kind of see the workmanship, the standards of workmanship at that point. And so we're kind of in the middle here with joinery. Dan is a cabinet maker, box maker, really fine, really getting to the nitty gritty. Whereas with joinery, you kind of have the 10-foot rule. If you stick it up on the wall and it looks right from a distance, well, there you go, it is right. There's an expression that my former colleague always said to me is that it comes from boat building, which is that if it looks right, it is right, because you can't see both sides of the boat at the same time. So same thing, if you're up in the parlor, the dining room, you're looking at this wall, you're not going to see the wall behind you, so they don't have to be exactly the same. So it's not quite as much agonizing. Whereas a piece of furniture that you can take, you set it in the middle of the room and spin it around, you of course need to be a little bit tighter on that. So with that, I've got some moldings here. The one that I'm going to be planning isn't this molding. I always go to the crown molding. It's just one of my favorites. It's actually one of the easiest of the ones we do, which seems counterintuitive. There's a much smaller one. One of these days I'll remember to grab it. It's a smaller one with only like 3 different facets. It was the biggest pain in the butt, but it was just because it was such a small profile. Really kicked our butts. Didn't look like it should have. This is really the easiest one. I like to use this one for demonstrations, especially letting people try, because once you get it kind of roughed out, it's just intuitive. It kind of follows the form, I should say. So with that, I won't get too far ahead of myself. I'll start from the very beginning. So this isn't necessarily the way that it would have been done, but it's the way we did it. So that's what I'll talk about. So if you're trying to impress your friends with, well, this is how John Hemmings did it, I can't necessarily sign off on that. But this is how Austin did it in 2021 at Poplar Forest. So what we started off with is our profile. We made it out of metal because it's a little hardier, and paper ones tend to not last as long. So we made this, and we mashed it up on the end of our board, traced it on. This is where we are working to. And put it on this side, walk it down, make sure it's in the same orientation, trace it on the end again, and then once you have that, then you can start worrying about removing material. And that's all that woodworking is. It's just removing material. I forget who said it, and this is probably a horrible requoting of it, but basically, I think it was a sculptor who said that they just look for the sculpture in the marble, and they just keep chopping away until it's revealed. And that's kind of what's happening here. You just get rid of wood that's in the way of the molding underneath. And that's kind of a really oversimplified way to say it. There's a picture of someone teaching how to draw an owl, and it's like 2 circles, and then the next picture is like the completed owl. And so it's not necessarily what I'm trying to give here. So I'll just jump into it. As we're removing material, there's 2 ways that we're doing it here. Primarily, we're using machinery to do the work of what their apprentices would have done. So that includes milling it down from a flat board. So I have here a board that I use it for demonstrations, so you wouldn't have had all these profiles on it already, but this is kind of my catch-all board. So we start with a board that's rough sawn like this. It's pretty wonky. That's the reason it's being used for demonstrations, is it's not an excellent board. But, so I started flattening it here. So I'll pass it around. This has been hit so far with the jack plane, or the 4-plane, and I think a little bit of the joiner. I don't know if the smoother has hit that yet. But that's what's starting off with your jack plane. It's got a fairly heavy camber cut on it, and that's just to hog away material. You're just getting rid of it, trying to get down to a flat surface quickly, because this is a lot of hard work, and so the less of this hard work you have to do, the better. So you're working it down, going across the grain, coming across, making sure you're all square, using the edge of your plane, kind of seeing if it's flat, square, and then use your tri-plane to true it all up on that plate. And then at that point, you're ready to rip it down to its rough dimensions. So that's roughly where we are now. We've flattened it. It's to the rough dimensions. You put your profile on the end of it. Now it's time to start hogging away, more refined hogging away. And we've got two different boards here. You notice these are kind of in points, little 45s, and then this is flat. So this is hogged out with the table saw, and this is hogged out with this plow plane. So most of the molding here, we use the table saw to bring it down very close to this profile. Because between two guys doing this work, that's a lot of effort, especially when we have one of those, and the other guy just kind of watching, cheering on the other guy. But in fact, we set up the table saw and run it through. I will say this, the most miserable part about making this molding was actually setting up and running it through the table saw. I almost would have preferred using the plow plane to do all this work. And mind you, it was about 80 linear feet of it. So I'll go ahead and pass these around, and you can see the difference between the two of these. And so that step where we use the plow plane to bring it down, like I said, those lines on the end, those are very important. Those are the ones you're going to be working to. And so this is only about a 2-foot section. We ran ours in 12 feet. I don't think they would have been running it in 12 feet necessarily. More than likely 8 feet, because that's a nice breaking point between the rooms. 8 times 3, who's that? It's 24. I'm saying that quick math, I had to verify it. So the parlor, you've got about 21 feet there, 3 8-foot boards. That breaks fairly nicely. Each of the ends of the octagons is about 6 feet, only about 2 feet of waste. Dining room is a 20-foot cube. So 8 foot is pretty good. And the reason I'm bringing that up is someone asked me, how long were the benches? Or, was there a standard size? What kind of bench was John Hemmings using? And then also, how long was the molding that John Hemmings was making? And so I think ultimately, if I had to really peg it, I would say that the length of molding that you're making is, first of all, constrained by the bench you're working on. And a lot of the times they're 8-foot benches, I think 6 foot. Williamsburgs are 8 foot, aren't they? At least the cabinet shop.
Yeah.
Joiners, I think, it might be a little longer. We went ahead and made the 12-foot bench in our workshop just because you could run two moldings in the parlor, two length of moldings in the dining room, and then at 12 feet, break it in half. There's some other rooms that it works well in, and the outer profiles, when you get to the tighter to the wall, they're around 6 or a little over 6, so you'd have to just break it at 8 feet. Regardless, the whole point of that is that you're running a very long board. And so you start here, as long as you've got yourself here and you don't pick it up the whole way through, you're pretty good. You're fairly confident you're going to get this same cut all the way down here at where you finish. So you're looking, I'm still pretty good. I've got a lot of meat here. I can hog away a lot of wood, so I'll just have at it. Keep going, check your line. Keep looking down. Peek on the back side. I tend to bite out more on the back end there, so I always have to verify. And that's the beauty of handwork. Also workmanship for joiners is that it's 10, 12, 20 feet up in the air. If you, like me, get a little heavy-handed on the offcut, you can kind of cheat that out a bit. You don't have to be, it's not like modern molding where, since a modern planer really can only cut a board square, if you cut it any other way, you've done something very wrong. You feed a board that through a planer that's flat on the bottom, it's gonna send you a board that's flat on the top. Whereas with hand tooling, that's not a guarantee that you get. And so that's why with modern work, you expect it to be perfectly flat and perfectly uniform because that's just the way that the machines are designed. It's really expected at that point. Whereas moldings, I neglected to bring in a piece of molding from an 1830s home here, but on the back of it, it was still rough cut. And you could see that they had just jack planed the reference edges of the back side of your molding. So this was all rough. You can still see the sash saw marks. And then jack planed here, but the front of it was nice. That's all that mattered. Because you're not wasting time with that. And even in the cabinet making world, if you were to peek inside of the pieces of furniture, even at the back of some desks and chests and things like that, it's not your prettiest work. I just saw a piece of furniture early 1800s, and the back of the tabletop, you could still see where they just ripped it. And I love seeing that. It's just great to see the fingerprints of the craftsman. Anyways, I'll get closer down to my line here. More strokes. So there we are. So let's say you're going along, you start down here, you get down to the end, and in the middle it's looking a little hairy. You're like, that's not quite as crisp. That doesn't look quite as right as what I would like. Like I said, this is a methodology that we employ here, not necessarily to say that it's right. I would say it's right, but I'm not sure how much that's worth. So we use scrapers, and scrapers would have been used, especially scratch stocks, putting in beads, things like that. I really love the scraper. I think it's one of the best woodworking tools that are out there. I think it doesn't get sung enough praise. So I'll sing a little tune for it now, or I'll let it sing for itself. So the scraper, the beauty of the scraper is that you put the profile on the end of it that matches, and I believe I've got the right one here. Yes. So you've got your scraping profile, and it acts as a cutting tool and a reference edge. So you started down here. Usually it looks pretty good down here and pretty good down there, or on the other side of the coin, since you know, well, I'm just going to cut it off. It usually just looks like trash. So you can't really trust that the middle has matched up. It's very close because, like I said, you start here and you're taking a consistent cut all the way down. But the scraper is excellent because you set it on here. You can see there's not a whole lot of light shining under there. I can see light coming through. I don't know if you can. But you've got this matching that very nicely. And scrapers are super easy to make. You can just file this shape on, and then you can even take the shank of a screwdriver and kind of bend over a little hook that's going to pull. And this one feels a little dull, so I'm not sure how much action we're going to get from it. Yeah, it's just pulling dust. But anyways, that's kind of how we get it. So you come through and you're like, well, that's a little bit more than scraping action work going on there. You whip out your pencil, kind of draw a line where this range here needs a little more attention. Come in and scrape it along. And so that's where the scraper is really handy, especially over 12 feet. You find sometimes a board will come out excellent. First time you get done with it, you can throw it on the pile, move to the next one. Then there are boards that take forever. It's just, you know, a thesis written all over this board where you need to go back and make corrections. And so, like I was saying, here at Poplar Forest, we typically weren't doing the entire board start to finish with traditional hand tools. Some of the moldings in the house do start all the way like that, all the way down, but since, you know, it's just easier to say, what you see, the surface, the final surface, is traditionally done with hand tools. So that encompasses everything, but there are some where we do start to finish with traditional hand tools. So I'll pass around one of these that's a little nicer. It might be this guy, but I had another one. There you are. Let's see, this one, you might be able to see the difference between them. Yeah. So I passed around the other boards. One was started with the table saw, and then one was started with the plow plane. So this was a table saw started piece of molding. This one was a plow plane started piece of molding. And go ahead and look at the differences. Ideally, there shouldn't be too many. There are a few differences. Namely, I'll point out that the fillet, this guy here and these sharp points up here, also your 45s like this, they're a little bit cleaner, a little crisper on the one that was run on the table saw. Because as you're going along, this is kind of what your board's looking like as you're moving along. And this is where I like to say, you gotta trust the journey, trust the process. Because in the middle of it, you're like, I have no idea how a molding is gonna come out of this. because almost every time it just looks like trash until like the last second. You're moving along, you take the scraper and you blink and it's done, and you're like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. And so that's what's really discouraging for a lot of people with traditional woodworking, is that it seems so insurmountable, and like, how can you go from just a chunk of wood like this and then pull this out of it, and all you're using is hand tools? Well, I really say it's not that hard, and if an average Joe like me can pick it up, I think anyone can. And I like to say that if you're interested in doing traditional woodworking, well, you're already 80% there. And so really though, that's really what it takes, because all it is, it's a bunch of easy steps all the way through. It's just a lot of them, which is why you gotta be interested in it. So that's kind of the process of molding. I'll go ahead and pass around some of these dumpy looking ones that are in the middle process. That way you can see just how the intermediate boards will end up looking. And I think that kind of covers what I've got here. I'll also send a bonus piece around. This is a piece of poplar, heart poplar, from the center of one of our trees that came down, I think in the early 2000s. So it was a tree that was about 250 years old, so a tree that Jefferson would have seen. A fun story I like to tell is how when I first came to Poplar Forest, about 6 years ago, I had just gotten into woodworking, or traditional woodworking I should say, and had only worked with like pine. And I'm from Wisconsin, we don't work with a lot of poplar up there. And so when I came down here, toured Poplar Forest, and I saw all of the woodwork, all the trim work in there, and it was all this, you know, really dark, beautiful poplar. And I was like, I gotta get my hands on some poplar. That's some of the nicest wood I've ever seen. And then I got into cabinet making, and I was just like, well, I was wrong about that. And I was like, what else have I been wrong about? But the point of that is that when you come to Poplar Forest, it's all very special poplar here. It all comes from the property. Even the new stuff we build from our parkway. But this stuff is really remarkable. It cuts really clean and smooth, and it's just got a really pretty color. And one of the nicest about poplar is as it ages, it actually darkens with the sunlight on it. Really pretty wood. Oh, I remember what I was going to say now. So the nice thing about heart poplar, Jefferson writes a letter saying that he wants it saved for the balusters on the roof because it's got good rot resistance and good weathering properties. And so all the balusters were being turned by an enslaved man by the name of Lewis, more than likely doing it up at Monticello. And I think he did come here. I don't think he was doing the turning here, but he was doing a lot of the turnings of the balusters and things like that. So we actually did our balusters out of mahogany, which also has good weathering properties. It was actually much cheaper and easier to source than heart poplar, I could imagine. But yeah, so that was just a fun fact I'd share. So I'll pass this around. You can see how dense and dark that wood actually gets. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan, and I'll clean up my mess a little bit for him.
So we had carpenters getting the framing done, the roof and all the basics. We got the joiners taking care of the trim and the doors and the windows. Now you need some furniture. In a classic sense, cabinet makers, cabinet referring to the person's personal space, would have a shop set up somewhere. You, the customer, would then go to that space, look at a book and say, oh, I like this, I like this. You go through a price list with kind of a la carte options. You want a chair that's plain, or do you want a bent leg cabriole, or you want a straight leg? You know, you want carving, and you put together your order. The cabinet maker in his shop makes what it is you order, and it gets delivered. And a lot of the furniture here was delivered. There was this letter about 36 stick chairs from a maker in Richmond, Virginia. Stick chairs meaning what we would call Windsors. Okay? That particular chair form has its roots, one of many roots, connected with what's called a Welsh stick chair. Little piece of trivia. So anyway, but a lot of the pieces that were here were made by the Monticello joinery. And we know that from the letters that were written and that kind of thing. So what I want to talk a bit about is the nature of putting together furniture requires, as we said, a higher degree of precision, because a 1/16 of an inch gap at the corner of a cornice, 15 feet in the air is one thing. 1/16 of an inch gap on something that you're using to write a letter on is like a crater. So most of the work I do is 32nd, 64th, unless I'm building this Declaration of Independence writing box, and there the tolerance is 128, just because the nature of the beast. There's quirks on building that makes it deceptively difficult, but I'll talk about that later. So the joinery that's most often associated with cabinet makers is your classic dovetail joint, and it comes in several varieties, but the most common of which is the through dovetail, where it's visible from both sides. Then the other is a half blind. In many cases, they don't want to see the joinery, which is one of the advantages of a half blind. For example, the front of a drawer. You don't want to see, pins and end grain on the front of your drawer, which is where the half blind is most commonly used. Front of the drawer is clean, but you can see the dovetail from the side. It's also oriented in such a way that, because the dovetail joint has strength in one direction, but not the other. It just pops apart side to side. Okay, but it has a lot of strength in this direction here. So you think about your joint and say, where are the forces going to be exerted? And you orient your tails and pins in such a way to resist those forces. This tool chest, mid-19th century, is dovetailed. Through dovetails right here on the corner. Okay, so which way is it oriented? Well, which way does it want to come apart? Pick it up by the handles. The weight's on the side. You don't want the ends coming off. So you orient the tails on the front so that the ends don't come out. Okay? But it does tend to go this way, but there's not much natural force going front to back. It's all end to end. So all the tails are on the front, all the pins are on the side. Now I have had to kind of open that up and glue it and help it out, but it's 180 years old, so when I get to be 180, I'll probably need some repairs. So that's the through dovetail joint, and there's key parts at laying this out that are incredibly important. Because if there's not squareness in the right spaces, then you're going to end up with something that either doesn't work or whatever. And if after we're done with the formal talk you want, I'll sit here and we'll cut some dovetail joints and you can kind of see where all it goes. But you've got a baseline right here. And this baseline matches the thickness of your mating piece. So the easiest way to get started, I'm not going to do, let me get a couple pieces of scrap here. For a quick practice, well, that's got a bead on it. So if I was going to put these together, an easy way to do it, set it like that. That's the baseline. Then, because these two pieces are going to go together, same thing on that. I just love the fact that so much traditional work, measuring is not an issue. It's the relative size of things. You can do stair treads with a set of pinch rods. Works beautifully for inside dimensions. So now I've got two pieces. I need to decide which one is which is going to be tails and which is going to be pins. There's a big argument in cabinet making, tails first, pins first. There are advantages both ways. I like tails first because it allows me to visualize the joint. Okay, so on this piece, I want to have the tails. So I'm just going to put one big tail right there. Okay, now I can either just saw that the way it is, or I can try to be precise if I want to get a specific pitch or angle to the whole situation. Can I bring a dovetail marker? Yep, I did. So this is a bevel gauge, tiny one, but it's all I need. And it's set for 1 and 6. Now what's 1 and 6 mean? So if you measure up from the edge of your bench 6 inches, and you make a line. Measure over 1 inch, you connect those 2 points, that's an angle. That creates a slope, okay? So that's my 1 6 pitch. So I can come in here, and by laying it one way or the other, I can more precisely lay out this tail. Now because I'm cutting these, I use a marking knife. Plus, I need to make sure that it is easy for a chisel to find if I'm doing that. Now this is a part where it has to be really square across the face. That has to be perfectly square. If it's not, then your tail is going to be tapered the wrong way on the wrong plane, and you're going to end up with a joint that either can't be put together or it's going to be completely rattled loose. So I go to my knife mark, and this is the advantage of a knife mark. With a pencil line, first of all, pencil lines are fat, okay, compared to a knife mark. So I can line these up perfectly just by feeling that knife mark with my knife, laying my square against the knife, and bring it across. And that is a very, very precise way to transfer that line around. Now, some people are brave. I'm not. So I mark this as to what part is the waist, okay? Heaven forbid you cut the wrong side of a line. Now my saw is over here. It's only 30 thousandths of an inch thick. But 30 thousandths on either side leaves this big black line, okay? So what I do now is I saw on the waist side of that knife line. So these teeth going right down that knife line on this cut, same on the other cut here. So the places where I need to be square, like I said, don't go too far. Go to the other side. Here's my line. There we are. So that just defines the tail. The fact that it's all wonky doesn't matter, because at this point in time, it could be anything you want. Now I need to cut across. Give me a stop. There's one. Now I'm trying to stay off the line. What that allows me to do is to come in with the chisel and get it straight. So the next place that has to be square. So the first square has to be right there. Second square has to be right across there. If that's not square, your joint's going to be really ugly. Okay? So what I'll do now is I'll come in with the chisel and I'll clean it up back to that scribe line that I made with this. Okay? My scribe's a little dull, so I would come in with the chisel and clean that up. Now we get to the transfer part. This is where the pins first guys have an advantage. For me to transfer this, clamp it here, I lay it out, and to make sure there's no twist, I take a big square, and I lay across here so that everything lines up. Come in with this and mark it out. Bring it up a little. Another place that has to be perfectly square, and that is transferring this line down the face, because that's the direction that the joint comes together. Where's my... Light's not that great in here. to help myself out. There. Okay. The transfer is important. Now you notice my marking knife has a bevel on it. One side's flat, the other side's not. So when I mark this side, I lay the flat all the way against it. If I did that on this side, it would be off because of the bevel. So I have to lean the marking knife over to make sure that it's perfectly in line. So now, if everything went right, mark out my waist. Saw on the waist side, so now I'm tracking the other side of that line. Trying to find my baseline in this darkness. So now, I need to remove the waist in the middle. With this part, it's easy, just sawing from the sides. Here we need to do some chisel work. And if I've done my point right, these two will fit together nicely. We'll find out in a little bit. So again, the square parts have to be across this surface and across this surface here. On these, the square parts have to be down the front and across the base. Okay? If those aren't square, it'll be ugly. So that's a through dovetail. Where did I put my sample through dovetail at? There it is. So I'll pass this around so you can see one that I... There we go. The half blind's a little bit of a different critter because you're not dealing... You have to do pins first on that because you're leaving a piece of the front undisturbed. So the first thing you need to do is to determine how much of the material are you going to leave undisturbed on the front. So this is a cutting gauge. It differs from a marking gauge because a marking gauge has a round pin, okay? And it works well on end grain, but it doesn't work cross grain very well. It kind of tends to tear, where this has a little blade. And so I use these for different situations. So if I'm going to be laying this out, I'm going to do this on the other side. I need to set this to determine the amount of material that I'm leaving behind. And I would transfer that over to this face. Take the mating piece and decide how far in it's going to go, which is this measurement here. And you would transfer that to this piece. So now you know how far it goes in by setting that. Take the thickness of your sideboard, transfer that to your faceboard. And now you've got a little hunk of material there that needs to have holes carved into it. You take your end board and you go ahead and you cut out the tail pattern you want. Now, since this is a drawer side, one of the advantages is that I can take that groove for the bottom of the drawer and hide it. So there's a little square piece at the bottom that covers that groove. Then I've got two tails. So I devise the pattern I want for this. I then lay it up on the end here, making sure I see where my line is, and then I do a transfer. So this would be, lay that in place and transfer it across. Now I can't cut all the way down because I want to leave this face undisturbed, which forces me to then work from the back side, and you would cut from this line down to the baseline at a 45. Something along those lines. Then you come in with a chisel and you start excavating that hole. And if you've excavated the hole, now where are the square parts on this? This base has to be square, where the bottom of that hole is. This face has to be square, okay? And on these, like any tails, across the face has to be square as well, okay? Anything else, as long as it matches one to the other, it can be as wonky as you want, as long as it's straight. Once you've excavated that, they should just nicely fit together and create a nice... Now, if you look here, you'll see what happens when you cut the wrong side of the line. That is the thickness of one saw curve. You can see how much it stands out, just like a glaring headlight. You wouldn't think that 30,000ths of an inch would look like that, but it does. Because you're not looking at 10 feet, you're looking at 10 inches. And you're looking for something that looks like it grew together. There are other kind of joints that we use in doing furniture. Obviously, mortise and tenon, and there's plenty of those sitting around here. But there's also occasionally when you put legs on tables. I've seen some demi-lune tables, some half rounds. The back legs, the apron, which is a curved piece, goes in with a mortise and tenon. Mortise into the leg, tenon on the end of the apron. But the front legs are often done in a bridle joint. You've got your apron coming around and you've got your leg, and it just goes right up through. Rather than doing more mortises and tenons, your apron is one piece with two legs stuck on with a bridle joint. The bridle joint is laid out just like a mortise and tenon, but you're cutting insides and outsides, but leaving them so that one slides over the other rather than into the other. So that's a bridle joint. Not all that common, but it does show up. Now, if you look upstairs on that dining room table, you look underneath, you notice that the center table has 5 legs. 4 for the corners, and then 1 is a gate leg. It swings out to help support the leaves. It actually has 6 because it's got 2 leaves. Some of the tables made, and I think there's a couple at Mount Vernon, if you look underneath there, it's got 4 legs, but 2 of them swing out to support the leaves. So how do they do that hinge? So this is a wooden knuckle hinge that I put together. And if you look up underneath that table, there's one exactly like it. And it's where you basically start with 2 boards, you lay it out like a mortise and tenon, you cut away opposite parts, but then you end up drilling a hole for your pin and rounding it over so that it moves free. So that's a wooden hinge that you'll find on gate leg tables and those kinds of things. An interesting joint, simple lap joint on the Campeche chair. This is a picture of one of the Campeche chairs. And if you look at the side, you get this, which is nothing more than a very stiff half lap joint. 2 boards, marking gauge down the middle with reference surfaces. You'll notice there's an X on each one for a reference surface. And you just remove complementary pieces of material and you work in the square. And then after it's squared up, then you come in with your turning saw and cut your shapes. So you don't get the shapes of the frame and then try to do the joint. You do the joint first, then you cut the shapes in. So that's a lap joint, just like you see on the side of the Campeche chair. That's actually left side. The picture here is of the right side. Oh, there is another joint that I've only seen once. Lord Cornwallis carried a table with him around the Revolutionary War, and it's down at the Yorktown Museum of American Revolution at Yorktown. And if you look at the corner of the top, you'll notice it's a miter on the top and a mortise and tenon in the bottom. 1.25 inches. And I looked at that joint, and it's taken me about 3 years to figure out the right combination of steps to make it. So this will be one version of a mitered mortise and tenon. It's done in pine. It's my first attempt. But it's laid out. You have to take your board and scribe off 1/4 inch, pretend it's not there. You treat the bottom part of the board as a mortise and tenon, and then that joint, that top part, you treat as a miter. And the hardest part is cleaning out the one section, because if you look at this is easy to clean up. Mortise is easy. This is no big deal, but between there.
That's impressive first attempt right there.
Yeah, well, I kept getting frustrated, and then a friend of mine who's a really good cabinet maker said, try plain maker's float or very fine cut rasp. I went like, oh, wow, you know, makes perfect sense. So that's how I was able to clean up in there to get that done. So some examples of things. We know that the Monticello Joinery made some bookcases, but they also made, and John Hemmings was the one who made them, 2 dumbwaiters. This is a piece of furniture that Thomas ran into in France. In his day, you typically have a meal, your servants would bring food in, put it onto a sideboard, and stand there. And if you want something, they bring it over to you. In France, they were building these devices, and you put your food on that, set it next to the host, and the servants would leave the room. The ones, this is a reference book of, there's one original that was built for here, that's in the collection at Monticello, built by John Hemmings. And so these are copies. This one is finished. This one's just in pieces, so if you want to see how it's done, but it's all mortise and tenon joints, except for this little bit of top carving, but I can talk about that if you're interested later on. Another thing that Hemmings made was the revolving book stand. Now, if you think, how many of you here have done a mortise and tenon joint? Okay. There are 32 mortise and tenon joints on this. Through mortise and tenons, the stock is 1/2 inch, the tenon is 1/4 inch. Okay? Because this is 4 boards with 2 battens, all mortise and tenon. These are 3 boards with mortise and tenons on all ends. Took me a while to figure out how to cut those without blowing out the sides. I came up with the thing, if you just gang them all together with a pair of hand screws and you cut every other one, allowing them to support each other. And you just keep working down until you end up with a piece of scraps supporting the sides as you chop those mortises. It's fun. So mortise and tenon joinery is a key part of this. Now, Hemmings did not make the original Declaration of Independence writing box. Benjamin Randolph, a cabinet maker in Philadelphia, did. But in 1823, Thomas's granddaughter got married. He had Johnny Hemmings make a copy of the Declaration of Independence box for them as a wedding gift. So Hemmings made one of these. And you'll notice there's 4 tails and 5 pins in an 1 1/4 drawer. You know, yeah, I had to make special chisels to clean that out. Very simple. It's a box with a drawer with 2 flaps, but if it ain't perfect, it'll bind. That particular one that Hemmings made was lost at sea when the ship with all their stuff sunk. So Thomas took the original, put a label on it, and sent it to him as a wedding gift. And in 1870, the family gave it to the Smithsonian. And that's where the original is at today, and that's an exact copy that I made. So I'm more than happy to stick around and talk details on cutting joints and that kind of thing, but you can begin to see how mortise and tenon joints are at the middle of everything. There's not a piece of furniture out there that doesn't have a mortise and tenon joint in it somewhere. It's just a matter of how precise are you going to be, how tight are the joints going to be, and how nice do you want it to look. There are tricks of using shim so you get a nice offset. So like on these, the front of the rail is flush with the style. You can do an offset for decorative purposes. An easy way to do that is with a marking gauge and a shim that's the size of your offset. So when you do the, and I get this right, when you do the tenon, you put the shim in, scribe it off, take the shim out, you scribe the mortise, and that sets it back in, the size of that offset. Or you can do math. So, we're here to answer questions, talk about anything you want, explore, make sawdust, whatever you want to do.
I will add one thing I realized when I was explaining making the moldings. I completely jumped over the molding planes and went straight to scraper. I want to clarify, we did not make these moldings entirely by scrapers. That would be unheard of. So I won't go ahead and finish shavings, but I'll show you the planes we used. So really quick, here we are. So hollows and rounds, they make complex molding planes that can do it. We know that John Hemmings was using complex molding planes. We just don't have any like that. So we did all of our profiles with hollows and rounds. And so to give you an idea, the reason I think it's so easy, or this is one of my favorite moldings, or it's very manageable, is once you get your fillet, so this is the wrong one, that would have been helpful. You cut a groove in here, or a reference point here. These are easy, you just kind of follow, it's the flats here, it'll ride on the 2 points. A good book I can recommend is Moldings in Practice by Matt Bickford, if you're familiar with it. Lost Art Press, they have a ton of great resources for that. That book is perfect to read. It gives the exact process of how they make moldings. So I recommend reading that book. My copy, I lent it out already, otherwise it would be here. But anyway, so your hollow cuts the round, and your round cuts in the hollow, and then you have this smaller repeating version over here. Another hollow cuts your round, cut your hollow over here, and somewhere around here I've got a rabbet plane, rabbet, R-A-B-B-E-T, or rebate plane. That's excellent for these fillets in here. And so going back to when I was saying you start on this end, finish on this end, that's where that rule really applies to these. Really any molding planes that you're using on long stock, follow your reference line here, consistent all the way down and on the opposite side. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I realized I completely glazed over the molding planes, which is the bread and butter of making moldings. So anyways, any questions at this point?
Where did you get your marking knife?
About 15 years ago, I've been going to the woodworking conference in Williamsburg for like 20 years. And one year, the blacksmith shop made up about 30 of these and put them in the gift shop there at the Prentice store, and I snagged one. So it's got a piece of tool steel, forge welded into the end. It's a gorgeous little tool.
Yeah, it's a beauty, yeah.
Yeah. This toolbox is one I can do about everything I normally do with everything in that toolbox, and they're almost all traditional tools. That way then I'm not taking the stuff off my workshop to put it in a box to go do a demo, and then, oh, where did I leave that? Oh, it's still in the truck, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to get a nice kit put together with everything I need to do stuff that I do on site and demos and that kind of stuff.
What are you guys sharpening with?
Diamond plates.
So I just recently got some diamond plates for the beginning process, really, just really aggressive ones. Because I was reading that diamond plates tend to cut more aggressively, and I was like, perfect, that's what I need. Otherwise, it's water stones.
Yeah. I use 400, 800, 1200, 8000, and then a leather strop.
How would they have sharpened them in period time?
Oil stones.
They would
Yeah.
use-
Yeah,
Arkansas stones.
Arkansas stones, or there's various stone formations throughout Europe that are along the same
Okay.
kind.
So that,
Yeah.
okay, so they did that.
Yeah, you know, but like any stone you use, you tend to get out of flat. The diamonds plates is just like, it's forever, you know. And it does cut very aggressively. So what takes 2 minutes on oil stone takes 30 seconds on a diamond plate, you know. Yeah.
Did you guys make the molding plates, or did? Or
No, these are, we had a tool collection donated to us early 2000s. They donated about 400 planes. Well, not planes, but tools. Majority of them were planes, and so we reconditioned them, tuned them up, and got them in working order. So I don't think I have, you can kind of see.
Do you have any extra?
No. In fact, I don't think we have enough. The only thing that, we make scratch stocks. I left our other one back over there. But we'll make them. I mean, plane making and tool making and tool refinishing is really, when you're a woodworker, you're not just a woodworker. You're a metal worker, you're a tool maker. And if you ever sharpened a saw, you're a metal worker.
Yeah.
Templates, scratch stocks, scrapers, there's a lot of
Bandsaw blades.
metalworking.
Yeah.
What was that?
Bandsaw blades, little
Oh, yeah.
scrapers I made out of bandsaw blades for.
Yeah,
different
old
shapes.
saw plates are perfect for scrapers, and these are a dime a dozen a lot of the time. But
Yeah.
I mean, you can see this is just the exact same material as where my scrapers. In fact, some of these are just made from old saw plates.
Mm-hmm.
So I've made quite a few from saw plates, or you can buy new spring steel.
Did you make that scratch stock?
This one, yeah. So that one came from a piece of boxwood. In fact, there's a clump of boxwoods over there. A branch came down from it, and I let it dry for about a year. But you can see it started to banana on me a bit. So I didn't wait long enough. I was a little impatient. But yeah, and it's nothing fancy. It's just a perpendicular piece for your reference fence. And I made this for, I forget what molding it is now, but it's just so that you can scratch it in. In fact, where do we have any down here? I don't think there's any moldings down here, but if you go back upstairs and all of the door architraves, there's a bead on the very inside. All of those beads were cut with a scratch stock here. It was a 1/2 inch scratch stock, and it's literally just scratching. It's amazing what you do.
On the revolving book stand, there's little ledges. Okay, I did all them with the scratch stock, and of course the returns on the end of those ledges are just carved in. They're not little pieces glued on. So
You were saying?
So no beading plane on those architraves, just the scratch stock?
The ones here were all scratched in. Like I said, we're not sure how they were done. We do have a beading plane. The beads, I think, on the wing might be done with a beading plane. There's an architrave down there we did with a beading plane. I personally like the scratch stock beads because you can get a much sharper relief.
And is that with the walnut or the poplar?
Poplar. So all of the interior trim, well, I'll just explain the individual parts. So the entablature, the door architraves, baseboards, chair rail, that's all poplar. The casings around the windows and between the doors, that's all heart pine. And then the windows and doors are walnut. And then all the floors are white oak. I think, and then there is references to a locust for the windowsills. But we just used heart pine here for ours.
Can I see the scratch stock?
Oh yeah.
the beads on the front of this one are all scratched in because I didn't realize there were beads all the way down until after I had it glued together. And then I did some like, oh, I'm supposed to have beads on there, so I scratched all these in this front. On the mating pieces over here on this one, then I just got appropriate beading plane because you can use the beading plane when you got the ends open, but here you're kind of, and even my scratch stock stopped about 1 inch in, so I had to come in with little scrapers to finish them up.
I bet
So this was the first iteration of our scratch stock.
Yeah, this is the version we have, and I mean, we have trouble with it.
I will say that one is nice because for especially doing anything curved, I will grab that one. That one is great. I don't even try to fiddle with that. It is kind of nice sometimes because you can get a lot more of a turn on it, so you can, where that little hook on your scratch stock is, you can kind of adjust it a little bit more. This one's a little bit more, you gotta have it, fairly sharp all the time, but it's consistent because it's got the fence.
This is beautiful with the boxwood. I love the feel of that.
I love boxwood. It feels like plastic, which is almost like a crime to say as a woodworker to say that I like that. But it's just so dense. It's kind of like defies expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how we described it too, hacking on it and messing with it. Yeah, I'm gonna take a picture of this one. I think I'm gonna copy your lead on this one.
Well, I just copied some other guys online, so yeah, that's really I used to feel bad about copying other people's work. I felt like I was lazy or kind of cheating.
It's flattering.
Yeah.
Flattering.
That's what an apprentice.
But that's really what everything is. It's just kind of sampling and remaking. And
Mhm.
I mean, if Jefferson was okay with copying everyone else, who am I to snub Jefferson?
I had a random question going
Yeah.
back to on your blind dovetails. I guess I've never looked it up. I've never kind of blind one my way through one. On the front, is there a ratio, traditional ratio of what you're leaving there, or are you just kind of like, it should be enough to keep it from shipping out and breaking? Or
The slope of the tails,
no, it's the straight up thickness up here. Do you go
Oh,
with
how
a
thick it
traditional
is?
ratio, or you're just like, it should be enough to keep it from
It's,
shipping out?
whatever you want to do, okay? There is no rules of thumb that I'm aware of.
That's what I was.
If it gets too thin, yeah, it's gonna get brittle, and it's gonna look ugly. If it's too thick and you don't have enough material, then you start losing strength when this drawer that you're gonna be pulling open and closed for the next, 250, 300 years,
Yale has a collection of furniture donated to them in the 1930s. I was looking at pictures of the drawers from their chest on chests, and they showed a bunch of different. If you're familiar with mortise and tenon, it's in issue 3, this article.
Oh, okay.
But
Probably have them shelving out already, yeah.
yeah, well, the half blinds, there's one particular shelf, or drawer I should say, and it's gotta be just like a 1/16 of an inch. And I was just like, how on earth did they not blow that out?
Yeah.
So yeah, it does seem to be just kind of whatever the guy was feeling.
Just showing off that.
Yeah. And if I'm an apprentice, my master says, this is how big you make it. Okay, that's how big I make it, And I'm working for him, I work to his standards, and after 6 or 7 years of that, that's what I do. It just becomes my habit, the ratio is. It's like, now you can look at from an engineering perspective and say the 1/3 ratio for mortise and tenons makes sense. You get a skinny tenon, it's gonna snap off. You get really thin cheeks on the sides of your mortise, it's gonna split out with any twisting or side forces. So there's an engineering reason to settle on that. So my guess is it's, tradition and habit. And what are you putting on the front? If you're gonna be veneering the front of that chest, which is something that happened a lot starting in the 1790s as we get into more of the Sheridan and Hepplewhite furnitures and veneerings, well then you can get it a lot closer because you're gonna be adding a 1/16 of an inch of wood on top of that after it's put together. There are people that have done through dovetails and then veneered on top of it, but then as the wood shrinks and moves, they telegraph through.
Mhm.
So you can tell somebody that's cutting corners and not doing a half blind when you look at the end of the drawer and you see these little shadows, of the pins and tails,
Do you sharpen your own dovetail saw?
I'm learning. I bought a, yard sale special back saw, and it's just a matter of sit down. It's like, okay, give it a try and working on it, So I've got 2 nice ones that are professionally sharpened that I use for all my close work. That's a skill that I want to get into, Plane making is a skill. I've made 1. There's a reason why plane making was a separate trade. It's just incredibly difficult, So can I make a plane? Yeah. Do I want to? No, but I learned enough. So like this one here, that's a $5 barn find, no iron, no wedge, all chewed up. Knowing what I learned from making one plane allows me to take that and turn it into a beautiful working tool for the price of an iron and a few hours of work. It's also got a neat story with it. You notice it's tapered, fat here, skinny there. This has seen thousands of hours of use. And I get a lot of questions, like I see there's a difference between what I call academic historians and folks like us, experiential historians. So if you look closely, you're going to see a dimple right there, okay? And an academic historian is going to say, there's a dimple there. And the working historian, like myself, says, how did it get there? Well, if you take it as a right-handed guy and you're going to work with it, where does the thumb fall? So the plane was not made with that dimple. That's just thousands of hours of magic. So, yeah, that plane has lost a good 3/4 of an inch of height from having the sole cleaned up. I had to patch the mouth and all that. But playing with plane making taught me how to revive things like that. So, that makes it cool.
With your
Yeah, the tote's loose. I gotta figure out how to tighten that up.
I have one like that, and I'm just afraid I don't wanna adhere it permanently, you know.
Yeah, so,
I've seen
It
a
works.
picture of an original that just had a pin. It just was doweled
Mhm.
through
Yeah.
the body of the plane.
So you can still remove it.
Oh. I haven't figured out how that tote is put in yet. You know, it's not just dropped in straight or it would just come out as loose as it is. So I'm thinking it might be hooked under or something, but I haven't started twisting on it to see if it's like nose first and then down, you know, so. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is. I've got some Ohio tool jack planes, and one of them the hook slides right out.
Yeah.
And it is, I don't remember which side it was. One of them is like that for
Yeah.
sure. Also got one that's some guy put a leather strap over that and
Yeah.
nailed both sides to keep it down. Kind of cool.
So-
Trying plane.
Is y'all's, sawhorse based on anything, or?
I think that comes from Chris Schwartz design. Chris Schwartz, he's the over Lost Art Press. I don't even. So this is his book, The Anarchist's Tool Chest. It might be in this book.
Or is it the workbench book?
It might be the workbench book, but
Yeah.
I'm 90% sure it comes from Chris Schwartz, my colleague and former supervisor here at Poplar Forest. He made these saw benches for us. He always lamented how heavy they were. He's always like, you need to make them out of pine. But I like them. I've never been too bothered by how heavy they are, and he did a great job with them. But no, from what I gathered, when it came to joiners and carpenters coming onto the job site, it was just kind of like, you pick through the lumber you got here, and you slap your bench and materials together, and so we're hoping to do a bench like that here, where we just slap it together with the material we have, because we made a bench a few years ago for the parlor that is a little too nice for what would have been here.
Well, one thing I like about these is that when I'm, move your cards, when I'm hand chopping some mortises, I can just sit right here. I get a perfect straight down view. Easy to stay this way, just wail away. You know, and it's anchored, it's quick to move and all that. Where if I'm working on a bench, I'm having to kind of lean over to stay lined up and straight. My back starts yelling at me and all that. So I have a couple horses that I use, put stuff on, you know, stack material and all that. But when it comes time to hand chopping mortises, that's exactly what I do, if the piece is long enough. If it's not, then I get a set of hand screws and I clamp it. But I can still sit there and just work on it.
And I will say one thing about this bench, as much as I do like this bench, I would not make it with these canted legs again. I find that I'm always having to avoid them. So for how stable it is, it's great, but they're personally a little frustrating to me when I'm sawing. So I think that's something I would change. But beyond that, I think they're great. So we are officially done. You're welcome to come up and handle the tools and material and whatnot.
When you're making more than one of something, story stick avoids errors in measurement. I did a set of paper drawings for this, full size. I transferred them all to that. And when it came time to do this, because you figure you got 4 legs with 8 mortises each leg, all in the exact same spot. So you just clamp them all together with the story stick, take a big square, just zip, 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 and they all match.